I'm going to start off by reading a little bit here from John chapter 10. This picks up right after Jesus heals the blind man in the previous chapter, chapter 9, and he's talking with some Pharisees. And he says, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, he that entereth not by the door into the sheepfold, but climbeth up some other way, the same is a thief and a robber. But he that entereth in by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the porter openeth, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calleth his own sheep by name, and leadeth them out. And when he putteth forth his own sheep, he goeth before them. And the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. And a stranger they will not follow, but will flee from him, for they know not the voice of strangers. This parable spake Jesus unto them, but they understood not what things they were which he spake unto them." So we have an example here in the Gospel of John of Jesus speaking in parables. Now, this isn't the only time that Jesus does this in the Gospel of John. Of course, he talks to his disciples about how he is the vine, his Father is a husbandman, and his disciples are the branches. All of that, clearly a parable. Now, when, for example, Jesus talks about himself being the bread of life that came down from heaven, I'm going to say that that's more literal. It may be a bit mysterious, but I'm not going to say that, oh, that's a parable, that's an allegory. I think Jesus was very literally speaking in John chapter 6, and it was a hard saying, and to this day we don't entirely understand it, and we take it by faith. But however, John chapter 10 about the sheep and the sheepfold and the shepherd, and in John 15 about the vine and the husbandman and the branches, those are allegorical. So I think it is fair to say that Jesus did speak in parables, and listen to the way it says it here. But they understood not what things they were which he spake unto them. That's how Jesus used the parables. He used the parables to speak to his believers. So he's talking with this group of Pharisees, and I think the blind man is present also, the man who was healed. I think he's also present because he's there worshiping Jesus. And Jesus starts talking and explaining things, says, "For judgment I have come into the world, that they which are blind may see, and they which are see be made blind." And he goes right on then into these sayings about the sheepfold and himself and as a shepherd. So that is the way that Jesus used parables. When he's talking to a group of people, he speaks in parables, and his believers will hear and understand. But people who don't believe, people who are there to justify themselves, people there who are trying to entrap Jesus maybe, or for whatever reason, they are there for the wrong reasons, and they are not open to his words, they don't understand what Jesus is saying. It's really quite a fascinating phenomenon there. So why do people say then that the Gospel of John doesn't have parables? Well, I want to clarify this a little bit, because the word parable that it uses here in the King James, that word isn't used in other translations. I have here the New International Version and the English Standard Version. In the New International Version it says, "Jesus used this figure of speech, but the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them." And in the English Standard Version it says, "Jesus used this illustration, but they did not understand the things which he spoke to them." And if you look at the Greek interlinear, John does not use the word parable. He uses a word paroimian. Now, I'm sorry about my Greek. I have no idea how to properly pronounce Greek, but John uses the word paroimian, whereas the word translated as parable is parabolae. Therefore, the King James translators took a little bit of liberty to translate it as parable, though it's not an inaccurate translation, but it's just not the same kind of speech that Jesus used when he spoke the parables. And so the King James calls it a parable, but other translations call it a illustration or a figure of speech, which is perhaps more accurate, as this wasn't exactly a parable. And of course, in the parables, Jesus usually tells a story about different characters who do things and enact some aspect of the kingdom of God. These I am discourses, I am the good shepherd, I am the vine, they are a little different from, say, these parables about the owner of a vineyard or the man on the road to Jericho. The parables, they have a certain way about them. They are stories in this particular kind of story that Jesus told to illustrate concepts of the kingdom of God or his second coming or the end of Jerusalem. These I am allegories are a bit different. So it is fair to say that there are no parables in the Gospel of John, but John does record some of these similar types of talk that Jesus uses to explain something in a way that believers will understand, but those who don't believe in him will not understand. So why did John not record the parables in his gospel? Well, I already talked about this in my last video. You can see it right there in that link, where I talk about how by the time John writes his gospel, the other three gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, would have already been circulating, and John was probably familiar with them, and it was probably a specific way of telling the gospel to new would-be believers that Matthew, Mark, and Luke more or less follow that same kind of structure to the story, and recording a number of the same miracles, a number of the same parables. Even there's a real similarity between those three gospels, of course. And when John decides to write his gospel, he is very likely familiar with that way of telling the gospel, and he decides to add on to it and not follow that same outline. So I think it's quite possible that the most important parables, maybe even all of the parables, were already recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And of course there are differences between those three gospels in which parables are recorded. So by the time John writes his gospel, I think it's very likely that the parables had already been covered, and so he chooses not to repeat them, but he does include many other sayings of Jesus, like this one about the sheep and the shepherd and the sheepfold in chapter 10. Now I also want to say that there are some stories in the Gospel of John that are almost like real life parables. What do I mean? Well, okay, there are these stories that John spends a long time relating, where it's the narrator telling these things that Jesus and these people around him do and how they interact with each other. And we're kind of getting this bird's eye view of Jesus going about several hours or even several days. And it's a very different kind of story than the usual Jesus did this, then this, then this, and this. Like, for example, let's look at Mark chapter 10, one of my favorite gospel chapters, very action-packed. It's such a typical Mark chapter, just action, 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 action. So many little stories falling one after the other after the other. Jesus did this, Jesus did this, Jesus did this. Yet in the Gospel of John, we have these three major stories where John just spends a long time relating one story. John chapter 2, the wedding of Cana. John chapter 9, Jesus is in Jerusalem and he heals a man who was born blind. And then John chapter 11, Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead and his interaction with Martha and Mary, going to Bethany with his disciples, Lazarus dies, that whole thing. Those three chapters, those three stories, are a different kind of Jesus story than the rest of the Jesus stories that we find in the Gospels. It is a very particular story, each of those, that does not include any sermons from Jesus. There are sayings by Jesus. He does have a speaking role in those stories, but these aren't stories that lead to a sermon, for example, like the loaves and the fishes in John chapter 6. And neither are they a relating of numerous stories of Jesus showing his power to save, as again, like say Matthew chapter 8, Mark chapter 10. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are full of chapters like that where Jesus is going about demonstrating his power, doing good, and showing very tangibly and actively the way he saves people. These three stories I'm talking about in John, they're like parables because they're a bit mysterious even, especially to me, especially John chapter 2, this whole story about this wedding in Cana where Jesus turns water into wine. Why so much time spent on that story? And then of course there's so much that we can get out of John chapter 9. I think about that chapter all the time. And chapter 11 may be a little bit more obvious because there Jesus is demonstrating his power in one of the most amazing ways in all of the Gospels. So it's a little more upfront there, what's going on and what that story is telling us. But even there is depth and mystery. So in those three stories, they're long stories with depth and some mystery, and in all of those cases, I think you have to be a believer to really get what the author John is trying to relate to us about Jesus. And we come up with different things, I think. It's like there's extra dimensions in those writings, and believers from all times, these whole 2,000 years, from so many cultures, we read those three stories, and we just get so many different things from it, and it's like an ongoing process. I feel sometimes like I'm living in those stories, and I'm just like constantly kind of growing and learning new things from them. So I'm going to say that in a way, John does include parables, but they're different. These are stories that tell us about the kingdom, about the nature of Jesus, but they're using actual events, things that Jesus himself actually did. While John left the stories that Jesus told to make points about the kingdom, he left those to the earlier writers who probably included all of them in their three Gospels. Well, please let me know what you think about all this. What are your thoughts about these stories that are told in the Gospel of John and these allegories? Why is it that people say that there are no parables in the Gospel of John? Is that correct, or are there caveats to that? I've shared my thoughts on that. Please share your thoughts with me in the comment section below, and we can get a conversation going. God bless you. Bye for now.